or hydrogen and CCS will be force-fed into applications for which they're not economic, resulting in higher prices, higher utility bills, higher taxes, and with little or no net economic benefit. That, for me, is the message that I hope you'll come away from at least my portion of today's presentation with, because it's a dilemma that our region has faced before in various ways. We either will see an outcome that is relatively inconsequential, at least from an economic standpoint, or it will be consequential, but in a bad way. And so I'm going to use the next few minutes to describe to you why, after looking at the data that I can find, I understand that to be the case. And my hope is that you'll understand that's the case, and ultimately, most importantly, that policymakers in the region will understand that this is the case. To do that, we've got to begin with what is being sold here. What is the proposition that's being presented to the region? And so just to do a real quick reminder of what the hydrogen hub consists of, we know it of course begins up there with hydrogen, blue hydrogen, or what the Department of Energy euphemistically calls clean hydrogen. Hydrogen that's made with the assistance of carbon capture to reduce the carbon emissions. And the expectations in a hydrogen hub, of course, are that that hydrogen will be sent by pipelines throughout the region to a variety of industries, including power generation, heating, transportation, various industrial processes. And at the same time, that there will also be a parallel network of carbon capture pipelines established to carry captured carbon, not just from hydrogen production facilities, but also from power plants and other high emitting facilities as well. And underlying that model of a hydrogen and carbon capture hub is a theory of decarbonization and economic development. And this, of course, is what we as a community, we as a region, are being sold. And the theory consists basically in two parts. The first is that we will convert existing industries to hydrogen and carbon capture in order to decarbonize them. And so, we will take power plants and we will bolt on to gas-fired power plants carbon capture facilities. And then, because we will have to create the infrastructure necessary to support that kind of decarbonization, the narrative that we're being given is that we will see an influx of new industry, that will attract enterprises looking to take advantage of the new hydrogen and carbon capture infrastructure. And from that, we will see economic growth, we will see job development, we will see all of the promises that we've heard made so often before. But there are two problems with this vision fundamentally, and this is specifically what we'll be quantifying and talking about today. The first one is that converting existing industry to hydrogen and carbon capture increases costs, but it does not increase output. There is no net economic gain. When we take a gas-fired power plant and we bolt carbon capture capabilities onto it, we're not increasing in any way the output of that power plant. In fact, we're slightly decreasing it, but we'll let that pass for the moment. But we are greatly increasing the costs of operating that plant, and we'll talk about those costs a little later on. So again, there is no net economic gain from this. The entire economic gain, apart from some temporary construction jobs associated with building the infrastructure, the entire economic gain is associated with downstream development, which is a really great concept because it's a promise made upon which the people making it almost never have to deliver. Downstream development is somebody else is going to come along and take advantage of this stuff. And the problem, of course, is that they often don't. And the reason why for this portion of the slide I used the iconography of the Shale Crescent, you know, the dream that we were hearing about 5-6 years ago, that we would see the emergence of a petrochemical cluster in Appalachia that might even rival in size the cluster along the Gulf Coast, is that it, of course, has never happened, and moreover will not happen. You know, you can see actually in this little slide, the dream was very specifically that we would see the energy sector. I wonder if I have a little thing here. The energy sector, of course, was the natural gas boom, production of massive amounts of natural gas, and that would give rise to a petrochemical sector. And the American Chemistry Council told us specifically what they anticipated that petrochemical sector to look like. It would be a fleet of 5 world-class ethane crackers of the scale of the Shell cracker up in Monaco. And then as a result of that, we would see a manufacturing boom of companies that would want to be close to their supplier of the raw material of plastics, of ethylene and polyethylene to be produced. Well, of course, we know what in fact happened was that the Shell cracker is the only cracker to have gotten off the ground. There are no others in the offing at this point, nor will there be. And of course, even around the Shell cracker, which is now in operation, there has been no manufacturing development whatsoever. And that is, regrettably, the scenario that we're looking at with the prospective hydrogen hub. This is a play that we have seen run before. We know the outcome of this. And so I'm going to talk to you for the next few minutes about why that is the likely outcome of what we're seeing. To understand it, we need to understand hydrogen a little bit. And probably the most important thing to know about hydrogen is that it has been around for a long time, going back to the first internal combustion engine in 1807 that actually ran on hydrogen. The question is, so why isn't hydrogen with us very much today at all? You know, why aren't cars powered by hydrogen? Why aren't homes and buildings heated with hydrogen today? Why don't power plants run on hydrogen? To help answer the questions, I'm going to lean on Michael Liebreich. Liebreich is the founder of what we know today as Bloomberg NEF, New Energy Finance. He has been in the industry for many, many years right now. And a few years ago, he came out with the hydrogen ladder, which is a ranking of a myriad of potential applications for hydrogen as part of energy transition. And what he did was apply 3 criteria: cost, efficiency, and market maturity to each of these applications, and he ranked them from unavoidable, meaning that there are no viable alternatives for decarbonization, to uncompetitive. And when we look at those 3 questions that I asked a moment ago, you know, why don't we see hydrogen cars in any great number? Why don't we heat buildings or houses with hydrogen? And why don't we generate power with hydrogen? Let's take a look at them one by one. First of all, land transportation. And you'll notice in Liebreich's ranking, cars, hydrogen-powered cars, are down here at the uncompetitive level, as are trains and buses, and as is regional or urban delivery. And rural trains and regional trucks are nearby there as well. The reason, and there are some transportation forms that lend themselves to hydrogen: off-road vehicles, remote trains, vintage vehicles, and kind of in the middle, long-distance trucks and coaches. The importance of that division is that the mass consumption applications, which are cars, trains, and buses, and even light trucks, are down here in the uncompetitive range. The places where hydrogen can play a role economically in transportation are largely niche applications that do not have a great deal of demand. And the reason for that is that, first of all, hydrogen is a very inefficient form. It's much less efficient in making cars and trucks go than batteries are. And moreover, it's way behind the curve. Right now, in contrast to the 2 models and roughly 72,000 hydrogen fuel cell vehicles on the road globally in 2022, there are over 26 million electric vehicles out there and 55 models from a dozen different automakers just in the United States. In other words, hydrogen is less efficient and it's way, way behind. That's why it ends up at the bottom of Lee Bright's rankings for this. So the second major mass consumption application for hydrogen, heating. And there are places, Britain in particular is looking at prospects for potentially heating homes and in some cases businesses and buildings with hydrogen. But you'll see again, the rankings are a tad better than they are for cars and trucks, but not much. And so we see domestic heating here and mid to low temperature industrial heat. There are some high temperature industrial heating applications in which it makes sense. And we'll talk about those because one of the things that I want to emphasize in this is that our concerns about hydrogen and carbon capture are not philosophical. We're not opposed to their application in all cases. There are cases where both of them have value and in fact may be necessary, and some of those are listed up here. And we absolutely support their application where they make economic sense to do so and where there aren't better alternatives. So let's go to the last one, the power system, power generation. Again, the thing that I'll point to here is that when we talk about power generation, the thing that most of us think about doesn't even make the chart. And that is when we think about power generation, you can use terms like base load power or firm power or dispatchable power, meaning plants that run more or less continuously and provide a regular ongoing flow of energy to the market. It doesn't even make the list. And that's because no serious person is even proposing that as a possibility because it is hopelessly inefficient. The power system related function, the only one for which hydrogen has potential is perhaps long-term storage. And long-term storage basically means in the event of catastrophe, when you've got nothing else you can turn to, there is hydrogen. But it is a solution of last resort and not part of any ongoing functioning of the grid. And so the reason for that, again, has to do with efficiency, or actually inefficiency. I did a blog post called Stupid Ways to Make Electricity a while back. I'm not always this formal, sometimes I get a little flip. But the DOE hydrogen shot goal price of $1 a kilogram for hydrogen, which by the way is 33% below the current market price even for gray hydrogen. Even if you can get hydrogen down to $1 a kilogram, that equates to just under $9 per million BTUs. As compared to natural gas right now, right now it's less than $3, but even if it gets up to $3.50, it gives you a sense of how relatively inefficient hydrogen is as a power resource. And we're going to look at that in greater detail because the power system in our region is of particular importance because, as you know, we identify not just, I suppose, psychologically as an energy region, a net exporter of energy, but it is factually a big, big part of our economy. But to show you how inefficient hydrogen is, this is the most recent chart from Lazard, in which they do a levelized cost of energy comparing different energy resources. And you'll see right there that little $116 per megawatt hour. That is their anticipated price for hydrogen, even if it gets down to $1.40 per kilogram, which is less than the market price for hydrogen right now. And that is for only a 20% blend of hydrogen. You know, again, if you have been paying attention to the power generation conversation about hydrogen, you know that it happens in two ways. Some people talk about just purely generating power with hydrogen alone. For instance, the Omnis project in West Virginia that was recently announced would generate electricity exclusively with hydrogen when fully operational. But oftentimes, and this is true, for instance, of the Long Ridge project down in Hannibal, Ohio, on the Ohio River, they're blending hydrogen right now at a rate of about 5%. They've talked about getting up to 20% and maybe eventually going full bore hydrogen. But this $116 is about twice the cost of power from gas-fired power plants right now, and that is for only a 20% blend of hydrogen. A 20% blend of hydrogen almost doubles the cost of power generation, and for that, you actually only reduce emissions by 7%. This is what I mean when I say hydrogen is not a great economic deal. It's not economic in power generation. Now, what we've just done in looking at transportation, at heating, and at power generation is that we've kind of taken the three big mass consumption applications for hydrogen off the table. What we're left with is kind of a dog's breakfast of niche applications in industries like cement making and steel manufacturing and other things that are not huge consumers relative to the three categories that we just looked at. And that creates a pretty significant problem. So again, the red X's indicate the areas that we've just kind of taken off the table. And that means that when you think of the vision of a hydrogen hub in which we see a massive network of pipelines connecting hydrogen manufacturing facilities to the various industries that would consume them, we've just wiped out the critical mass necessary to support the cost of that kind of infrastructure. And that's true again for those industries for power generation as well. But we've also wiped out the critical mass necessary for a second component, and that's the carbon capture pipeline network. Now again, remember going back to the original logical view of the hydrogen hub, there are two pipeline networks necessary to support this creature. One is hydrogen, to disseminate the hydrogen to the various industries that would consume it. And then the second pipeline network is the carbon capture network necessary to capture, transport, and ultimately sequester the hydrogen or the carbon underground. The problem that we have as a region is that, and this is from the Great Plains Institute, which by the way is one of the organizations supporting development of a hydrogen hub. This is what the guys who actually support it say is going to happen. About 90% of all of the point source carbon that is generated in our region comes from gas and coal-fired power plants. And so if you say, oh my golly, carbon capture isn't cost effective for coal and gas-fired power, you've undercut the critical mass necessary to justify the expense of this massive pipeline network. And to show you we've only focused on the cost of hydrogen so far. Let's talk for just a moment about the cost of carbon capture in gas and coal-fired power. And the quick summary is that carbon capture nearly doubles the cost of electricity from natural gas, and it triples the cost from coal. And frankly, these figures are not even at issue. Even proponents of this acknowledge the numbers. And the reason they do it is because with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, we know what the cost of carbon capture is. It doesn't matter how much technological innovation takes place. It does not matter whether we get better at capturing carbon, because the $85 per ton credit that is provided guarantees that it's going to cost $85 a ton. And so in the case of a coal-fired power plant, right now, power in the PJM market through last month for this year costs just a little over $40.62 per megawatt hour. That means that a 1,000 megawatt coal-fired power plant running at a 70% capacity factor would generate $250 million worth of electricity annually. But because you get almost a ton of carbon for each megawatt hour that you generate in coal-fired power, that $85 ends up means that same amount of electricity that you're generating in the world of the IRA now costs almost $750 million. It's just a fact, it's physics. In the case of gas, which is less carbon intensive than coal, you do somewhat better, but it's only about a doubling. So that same $250 million of power, we would have to start paying $450 million, $460 million for it. And so the question isn't what it's going to cost. The only question then is how is it going to get paid for? And we can get a hint of how it's going to be paid for by what is being said by the proponents of this. The first is that, you'll know that many of you probably remember that about a year and a half ago, I guess maybe it was September of last year, Joe Manchin famously said of carbon capture, it's so darn expensive that it makes it almost impossible. He said that after a meeting that was held with the head of the West Virginia Public Service Commission, PSC, Chairman Charlotte Lane. And by the way, Chairman is the way Charlotte Lane insists that she be described. She will not stand for chairperson or anything like that. But they had a briefing document which is shared with you in the various materials that you have, in which they provide, American Electric Power provided to Charlotte Lane and Joe Manchin their estimate of what it would cost to outfit, in this case, the Mountaineer Power Plant in West Virginia. It's a 1,400 megawatt plant, coal-fired power plant. And you'll find their numbers are consistent and in fact somewhat greater than the numbers I just described to you a moment ago. But more importantly, perhaps, is that the Energy Futures Initiative, which many of you will identify with Ernest Moniz, the former Energy Secretary and a major proponent of carbon capture, who helped front and author the Roosevelt Project report for Southwest Pennsylvania last year. In their estimation, the $85 per ton subsidy provided in the IRA is insufficient to induce most industries, including coal and gas-fired power generation, and a number of others as well, including steel making. It's still not sufficient to be able to get them to tumble and actually implement it. Which means that the cost estimate, the doubling of gas-fired power and the tripling of coal-fired power that I talked about a few moments ago, is, if anything, an underestimation of the cost. Because what they're saying is that we're going to need more. And in fact, well, so, yeah, good point to summarize. This is why I do slides. So, basically what we've said is that there will be, unless something happens to change the picture, a serious dearth of demand for hydrogen and carbon capture, and therefore for the infrastructure to support them. The problem, though, is that the entire economic development model that has been proposed to us rests on that not being the case. If you don't get the pipeline networks, if you don't get those things that they say are going to attract companies to come to the area and set up operations to take advantage of clean hydrogen and to take advantage of carbon capture, then you have no economic development. You just have industries that are doing now what they already do, except they're doing it more expensively. That's it. And so that's why the only options are then to force feed hydrogen and carbon capture, or failure, at least from an economic development perspective. And so what's the solution to this? What is being proposed? The simple and inescapable truth is that carbon capture and sequestration, which is involved in the manufacture of blue hydrogen, makes everything it touches far more expensive. And right now what we're seeing is the policymakers, bureaucrats, and fuel-related industries' principal response so far has been to conjure up ways to make us pay. And I should have put the word more right there. And so what we're seeing is a series of what are effectively desperate measures. Because when you think about the Inflation Reduction Act and also the infrastructure bill, the provisions, the benefits of those are almost entirely on the supply side. They're going to provide tax credits for implementing carbon capture. They don't do much of anything on the demand side. And the problem is coming back to haunt them at this point. And so when you look, I just grabbed a few headlines from the last few weeks from Energy Wire. DOE launches $1 billion plan to drive demand for clean hydrogen because they know there isn't enough and they're afraid there won't be. EPA says carbon capture is in reach, utilities aren't biting. Down your throat, Biden pushes CCS on polluted places. The problem that I'm talking about isn't one that just exists in my mind. They know it's real. And because they don't have any real significant demand side solutions for it, they got a major problem on their hands. And so what's happening is, and we see it in state legislatures, but even from the White House Environmental Council, they're encouraging states to take actions that will raise utility bills and increase rates to fund even more subsidies. And again, this is referenced in your material, you can go see it. But they are recommending a variety of measures, including tax breaks they mentioned specifically, declaring CO2 storage to be in the public interest, public assumptions of liability, and offtake agreements, meaning that they're suggesting that governments and public service commissions enter into agreements that will require the public to pay above market prices for the output of whether it happens to be electricity or whether it happens to be blue hydrogen. They are beginning to push down to the state and the local level the need to make the cost even greater. And that has very specific implications for us as an organization, for many of the advocacy organizations in the region, but also for you guys as reporters. Because inevitably, I mentioned a minute ago how critical the power generating industry is in our region because it produces 90% of the carbon. It almost inevitably means that as the push to induce greater demand goes on, it is almost inevitably going to have to reach heavily into the power generating industry where carbon capture is at its worst as an economic proposition. And that means that right now, a discussion and a debate that's taken place largely to somewhat degree in legislatures and in the federal government with DOE is going to get pushed to new forms and new bodies. We're going to be having this discussion in boardrooms of utilities, but also in public service commissions and in other cases. This debate is going to start cropping up in other places and where we as an organization will want to be active, but I hope where you as reporters and journalists will follow it, because that's where it will come back to bite ratepayers and citizens. And so what's the end game of this? How does this thing play out? Like I said at the beginning, we've been here before. Back 15 years ago, it was the natural gas boom. And some of us at the time said the natural gas boom will happen, but it will not spin off significant job growth and economic development. And to be very blunt, I'm going to do and I told you so. We were right and they were wrong. It did not generate job growth. It did not generate significant economic development in the region. Then we were told about the Appalachian storage hub and the petrochemical renaissance, the petrochemical cluster that I mentioned before. And of course, they did not manifest either. And I would point out that the principal reason, there are actually many, but the principal reason neither of these things manifested is, again, lack of demand. The same problem that is haunting the hydrogen hub now is the same problem that killed these two things. And there's only one reason why I'm telling you that there's an either-or going on here. Either the hydrogen hub will be inconsequential or it will be consequential but in a bad way. The only reason that second option exists is that unlike with the Appalachian storage hub and the petrochemical cluster, there's a wild card in the game now. And that is the IRA, the infrastructure bill, and any additional subsidies that they can conjure up in one form or another. Those did not exist for these two things. And if they didn't exist now, I would say that the fate of the hydrogen hub will be the same as those. But the concern that we have as an organization right now is that in addition to whether it happens or not, that a hydrogen hub won't generate significant job growth and economic development, is that because of what in some cases are excessive and frankly absurdly high subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act and other subsidies that are being contemplated right now, it will cause people and industries to do economically irrational things. And in fact, we're seeing it start to happen right now. And as evidence, I would point to the Fidelis project, Blue Hydrogen project, that was recently announced for Mason County, West Virginia. A blue hydrogen facility that, if they do what they say they're going to do, would produce 240,000 tons of hydrogen a year for which there is no market. We'll wait and see if it comes true. I mean, if the Energy Futures Initiative is right in their assessment, the incentives are still not there that are necessary to attract the financing, but we'll see. And so I just want to close. This, I was saying on an optimistic note, this is pretty feeble compared to what I just laid on you, but I do want to point out that there is an alternative pathway to decarbonize Appalachia. What I've just been describing is the fossil fuel-based low road, in which ultimately we end up actually not getting there. We do have an alternative high road, which is an energy transition that's based on an embrace of renewable resources and other things. And in fact, and as I will mention in a minute, we have pointed out before in previous reports, and I'm thinking particularly of the Stratogen report, that clean energy high road is the one that actually not only is less costly as a means of energy transition for our region, it also does a much better job of economic development. And so I hope that as we go forward, we will keep in mind that there's an alternative, because this is not, you know, even after the Department of Energy does its designation of hydrogen hubs around the country, it's not as though it's a night and day game over, this is the direction, this is where we're going. Because frankly, the amount of money associated with the DOE designation is chicken feed. They've got $8 billion to spread around the country nationally. Just doing the hydrogen hub in our region will probably take over $200 billion worth of investment if what's being proposed to us were to unfold in the fashion that it's being predicted to happen. The success or failure of the hydrogen hub is going to depend mostly on the market, not on what the federal government does, apart from the fact that apart from its ability to tip the scales in the form of tax credits. And so, and it's not as though the game will be over that day then. It means that at any point along the way, or even in parallel, we can pursue a clean energy alternative that may over time win out. But I also wanted to mention to you that we've got a couple of other reports. One that is out, the Centralia Model for Economic Development, which describes why the clean energy pathway is more cost effective. And I also wanted to mention that the long-awaited, and I promise you, John Hurdle, wherever you are in the room, I've been waiting as breathlessly as you have for this, but on next week, we are going to be unveiling a new analysis from Ohio State University in which they looked at the underlying causes of the remarkable economic recovery of Centralia, Washington from its coal mine and coal-fired power plant days to what is happening there now. And they have determined a significant causal relationship between the model that is described in that document and the outcomes that have been experienced there. And they have found that that model is in fact replicable in our region. So I hope you'll pay attention when that comes out. I know Ben is putting together an event on the 20th. And so again, I apologize for getting the day started on what feels like a bit of a downer. But I think it's important that we face this, and I hope going forward that especially, you know, you guys who are reporters in the room, I hope you will, at the industry conferences and as announcements come forward, begin to ask those really tough questions. Like when somebody says, I'm gonna be producing a gazillion tons of hydrogen, ask, who the hell is gonna buy this stuff? What's it gonna cost to do it? What's it gonna cost to retrofit your power plant to run this thing? And who's gonna pay for it? So again, thank you very much for your time. And Ben or Tom, who am I?
Pass it to Tom next.
Pass it
Thanks,
to
John.
Tom. I should have, are there